The buried question. We all think we know how the war ended. The images are seared into memory. The Nuremberg trials, the black uniforms on the gallows, the banners torn down and burned in the streets. The world looked at those moments and believed that justice at last had spoken. The villains had faces. The guilty had names. Germany would never forget. But history is rarely that simple. For every man in the dock, there were thousands who never stood trial. Ordinary neighbors, clerks, school teachers, janitors, and postmen who had whispered names to the Gestapo. The ones who slipped letters through mail slots in the dead of night. The ones who pointed a trembling hand when the black car arrived on their street. They were the unseen army of the Reich. When the bombs stopped falling and the camps were liberated, these people did not vanish. They simply put their coats back on and went home. They opened their shops again, swept the broken glass from their doorsteps, and looked away from the ruins that surrounded them. The record of their deeds, if one ever existed, was burned, buried, or quietly forgotten. Germany in 1945 was a land trying to breathe again. Cities lay in ashes. Roads were filled with refugees, children without parents, and soldiers without flags. Amid the rubble, there was a fierce, desperate need to start over, to rebuild, to erase, to pretend that everything before had been a fever dream. And so silence became the first law of peace. The Allied authorities faced a mountain too steep to climb. They wanted justice but needed stability. Every document they uncovered revealed another 1,000 names, another 1,000 potential defendants. But how do you put a nation on trial without destroying it all over again? The files piled higher than the ruins. The investigators were overwhelmed. And as they sifted through the paper, another reality took shape. The Nazi state had not been powered only by fanatics or officers in SS Black. It had relied on millions of everyday citizens who volunteered to inform, to accuse, to condemn. The numbers told the story. At its peak, the Gestapo employed roughly 32,000 official agents across the entire German Reich, tasked with watching over 83 million people. It would have been impossible without help. Historians now estimate that 2 to 4 million Germans, perhaps more, regularly served as informants. Every apartment building had a caretaker who kept notes on who came and went. Every post office had workers who opened suspicious envelopes, steamed the glue, and copied the words inside. Every school had teachers who noticed which students failed to show up for Hitler Youth meetings and quietly filed reports. The Gestapo didn't need to be everywhere because everyone else already was. This system was not born from fear alone. For many, informing became a way to belong, a way to be useful, a way to feel righteous in a world where silence could be dangerous. They were told it was their duty to protect the fatherland, to defend order, to help cleanse the nation of traitors. And so they wrote. Letters of denunciation filled the desks of regional offices, a shopkeeper reporting a customer who joked about Hitler, a secretary accusing her co-worker of listening to foreign radio, a neighbor turning in a widow for keeping company with a foreign laborer. Most of those letters began the same way: Dear Gestapo, I feel it is my patriotic duty to inform you. Each one might as well have been a death sentence. In Hamburg, a lone population 1.7 million, there were just 43 Gestapo agents. Yet from 1933 to 1945, over 15,000 denunciation letters crossed their desks. 15,000 names, 15,000 betrayals, friends turning in friends, brothers denouncing brothers. When British tanks rolled into the city in May 1945, those 43 agents were hunted down, arrested, and eventually tried. Their names filled the headlines, but the 15,000 letter writers, they vanished into the crowd. They went home, lit their stoves, and tucked their children into bed, as if nothing had happened. No one came for them. No one asked questions. The war had created too many crimes to count. And as the Allies began their massive program of denazification, they quickly learned that the web of collaboration was far deeper than anyone had imagined. Prosecuting every informant would have meant putting nearly 20% of the German population on trial, millions of people. There weren't enough judges, prisons, or paper in the country for that, so the decision was made. The small fish would swim free. The architects of terror, the SS officers, the camp guards, the party leaders, would bear the weight of guilt for the rest. The others, the helpers, the nameless informants, would simply disappear into post-war society. It was a choice both practical and tragic. To rebuild a nation, the Allies needed administrator, teachers, engineers, police officers, exactly the kind of people who had often served the old regime. Without them, Germany couldn't function, so the past was quietly set aside. The word collaborator faded from conversation. The files were locked away, and soon after, many of them were destroyed. In 1946, American occupation authorities ordered the burning of local Gestapo records. Truckloads of papers were fed into furnaces across the ruined cities. The smoke that rose carried with it the names of tens of thousands of informants. An entire moral reckoning turned to ash, but not everything burned. Some clerks hid boxes in basements. Some records were misplaced, forgotten, or simply overlooked. Years later, when historians uncovered fragments of these archives, they found a haunting truth. The same names reappeared in post-war documents, employment rolls, civil service rosters, even school staff directories. The informants had not only survived, they had prospered. Germany was eager to move forward. Newspapers spoke of reconstruction, not retribution. Churches preached forgiveness, not confession. And families, millions of them, made unspoken agreements never to mention the war again. The silence became a kind of second occupation. It lingered in the streets, in the way neighbors avoided eye contact, in the way children were told not to ask about the past. For a generation, the subject of wartime betrayal vanished from public memory. But memory, like history, does not stay buried forever. Every society that survives catastrophe must face the same question. How do you rebuild when the foundations are soaked in guilt? How do you teach your children about right and wrong when you yourself once pointed a finger that sent someone to die? For Germany, the answer was to build higher, faster, to cover the ruins before they could be studied too closely. Yet beneath the new bricks and concrete, beneath the highways and the schools, lay an unspoken truth. A nation's greatest secret is not the crimes of its leaders, but the silence of its people. The Gestapo may have fallen, the swastikas torn down, but the habits of fear, obedience, and surveillance did not vanish overnight. They lived on in the hearts of millions who had once believed that loyalty meant suspicion and safety meant betrayal. In 1945, the guns went quiet, but another kind of war was just beginning, a war for memory, for truth, for the right to look one another in the eye again. And so, as the world celebrated victory, an entire generation of informants melted back into the crowd. They thought their names had vanished with the smoke. They were wrong, because history never forgets, it only waits. The invisible empire of surveillance. The Gestapo's power was not measured in guns or uniforms. It was measured in whispers. While most imagine a vast, omnipresent secret police force lurking on every corner, the truth was far more unsettling. The Gestapo didn't have to be everywhere because the German people made sure they didn't need to be. By 1939, the Third Reich had perfected something terrifyingly efficient, a surveillance state powered by its citizens. Only a few thousand agents monitored an entire nation of 80 million. The rest of the work, watching, listening, reporting, was carried out by those who lived next door. Historians call it the culture of denunciation. But inside the homes and hearts of those who participated, it was something more personal, a transaction between fear and belonging. To inform on someone was to prove loyalty, to keep oneself safe, to be useful to the cause. It began small. A shop owner overheard a man joking about Hitler and wrote a letter. A teacher noticed a student missing from Hitler Youth drills and made a report. A neighbor saw a woman visiting a Jewish friend and decided it was safer to mention it to the police. Each act felt minor, insignificant, until it wasn't. Every denunciation triggered a chain reaction. The Gestapo investigated, interrogated, and punished. People disappeared overnight, leaving behind cold teacups and unmade beds. The next morning, life went on. The trains still ran, the stores still opened, and the silence grew thicker. In the city of Hamburg, a population of 1.7 million generated more than 15,000 denunciation letters between 1933 and 1945. 43 Gestapo agents managed the entire city. That meant every agent received hundreds of reports, many written by people they never met, each letter dripping with righteous certainty. Some wrote from fear, terrified that their own silence would be seen as complicity. Others wrote from jealousy, spite, or greed. A denunciation could clear a path to a promotion, an apartment, or even a lover. And yet, the most chilling letters came from those who believed they were doing the right thing. To them, informing was a civic duty. The state had become a religion, and the Gestapo its priesthood. Postmen steamed open envelopes and resealed them without a trace. Building caretakers kept records of guests and visitors. Doctors filed reports about patients who complained too loudly. Even priests whispered confessions in reverse, passing names from the confessional to the authorities for the good of the nation. The web was so dense that trust itself became a liability. Husbands feared their wives. Parents warned their children not to speak carelessly at school. The line between public and private life dissolved entirely. Under this regime, suspicion replaced intimacy. Words became dangerous, laughter a weapon. The Nazi state did not need to force obedience, it had taught people to enforce it upon themselves. And it worked. Every whisper, every nod, every letter served as oxygen for the Gestapo's fire. The machinery of terror became self-sustaining. People policed each other out of habit. The secret police simply gathered what was offered freely. Years later, when historians combed through what little remained of the Gestapo's archives, they were struck by one consistent pattern. Most investigations did not begin with Gestapo officers. They began with ordinary people, neighbors, co-workers, relatives who had reported something. The police files were filled with betrayal written in tidy cursive. My neighbor frequently listens to foreign broadcasts. A co-worker spoke disrespectfully of the Führer. A woman in my building associates with Jews. Each line an accusation, each accusation a potential death sentence. And yet, to those who wrote them, it felt like duty, an act of patriotism in a nation that rewarded loyalty above love. To understand how such a system could exist, one must understand the psychology of fear and power intertwined. Under the Third Reich, authority became moral truth. Questioning it meant not only danger, but moral corruption. By turning citizens into informants, the state rewired their sense of right and wrong. The Gestapo didn't rely on violence alone. It relied on complicity. The threat of punishment was enough to keep the reports coming. And once a society learns to trade conscience for survival, the exchange becomes instinctive. The historian Robert Gallatley once wrote that the Gestapo was not omnipotent, but omnipresent through its people. That presence was invisible but inescapable, a moral infection spreading from one person to another until it seemed natural, even necessary. It was not soldiers who made Germany a prison, it was its citizens. By 1944, even as the Reich crumbled, the denunciations continued. In some regions, the volume of reports increased as the war worsened. People sensed collapse and clung tighter to the only power they understood: control over one another. In Berlin, the Gestapo office at Prince Albrechtstrasse received an average of 500 civilian denunciations every day. Many were anonymous. Others proudly signed their names, certain that history would vindicate them. It is tempting to imagine that these informants were monsters or fanatics, but most were ordinary people who baked bread, taught school, delivered mail. Their letters were written on lined paper, often with neat handwriting and polite language. "Dear sir," they began, "I regret to trouble you, but I believe you should know." They were polite, obedient, and deadly. This ordinariness is what makes the story unbearable. Evil did not wear horns, it wore spectacles and aprons. It stood behind counters and desks, humming softly as it prepared another report. The Gestapo perfected the art of making everyone guilty. And when everyone is guilty, no one is responsible. That was the true brilliance and horror of the system. It transformed morality into bureaucracy and conscience into paperwork. The Gestapo agent who signed the arrest order could say he was simply following procedure. The neighbor who wrote the letter could say she was simply doing her duty. Each act felt small, manageable, survivable, and together they built an empire of fear. This invisible empire did not vanish with Hitler's death. It lingered in the post-war years as a kind of shadow memory, a collective habit of silence, suspicion, and avoidance. Because once you learn to watch others, it's hard to stop. Once you've been rewarded for obedience, freedom feels like danger. For those who survived, the hardest truth was realizing that the Gestapo's reach had never been supernatural. It was human, painfully human. The terror had not been imposed upon them, it had grown from within them. When the war ended, many of these informants sat among the ruins and told themselves they had no choice. They had done what anyone would have done. They were victims too. And perhaps in some twisted way, they were right. They had lived inside a world that demanded complicity for survival, but survival is not innocence. The Gestapo collapsed in 1945, but its shadow survived in the collective psychology of a nation that had learned to equate morality with obedience. Years later, as archives reopened and stories surfaced, a chilling realization took hold. No one had forced the German people to become the eyes and ears of the state. They had volunteered. It wasn't the Gestapo's strength that built the surveillance machine. It was the people's willingness to serve it. And as the world celebrated liberation, the foundations of that invisible empire remained intact. Behind every ruined street, beneath every rebuilt wall, the echoes persisted, the voice that whispered the letter, that condemned the silence that followed. The Gestapo was gone, but the habits it left behind, the fear of speaking, the comfort of obedience, the reflex to look away, those would take generations to die. Because terror doesn't end when the regime falls. It ends when the people who fed it learn to stop whispering. When the war ended, justice fell silent. May 1945. The sound of gunfire faded, and the ruins of the Reich lay smoldering beneath a gray European sky. The flags had changed, but the faces remained the same. Germany was a defeated nation, yet its people, millions strong, stood in quiet disbelief, exhausted, hungry, terrified. The victors came with orders for justice. But justice, like food and shelter, was in short supply. The Allied forces marched into cities that were no longer cities at all. Cologne, Dresden, Hamburg, each a skeleton of brick and ash. The smell of smoke clung to everything. And somewhere beneath that rubble were the files, the letters, the evidence of betrayal written by the people themselves. The Gestapo agents were easy to find. They had uniforms, records, offices. They could be arrested, interrogated, tried. But the vast web of informants, millions of them, were invisible. They were farmers and bakers, teachers and mothers, men who had written letters, women who had whispered names. They looked like everyone else. When the Allied soldiers asked who were the collaborators here, the answers came in shrugs. No one knew. No one remembered. For the victors, the mission was clear: to destroy Nazism root and branch. But reality quickly collided with arithmetic. If every informant, every clerk, every accomplice were to be punished, the entire nation would have to be imprisoned. Denazification, the word itself, sounded noble, even surgical, but it was chaos disguised as policy. The Americans began with questionnaires, the Fragebogen, a set of 131 questions designed to determine each citizen's involvement with the Nazi regime. Millions of copies were printed. People lined up to fill them out, their answers deciding whether they could work, travel, or even buy food. Were you a member of the Nazi Party? Did you hold office in any organization affiliated with the Reich? Did you denounce anyone to the Gestapo? The last question was rarely answered truthfully. In theory, it was a system built for justice. In practice, it became a system of survival. People lied, omitted, or forged their way into innocence. They claimed ignorance, coercion, confusion. I was only following orders. I didn't know what happened after I reported them. Everyone else was doing it. For those who had truly suffered, it was unbearable. Survivors of the camps returned home, only to find their persecutors back in uniform, this time wearing the badges of the new democratic police. The teacher who had denounced a child for skipping Hitler Youth meetings now stood before a new classroom teaching moral renewal. The irony was suffocating. Allied tribunals faced impossible choices. Should they punish a man for writing a single letter that led to another man's death, while letting a factory owner who used slave labor go free? Should a typist be treated the same as a concentration camp guard? There were too many shades of guilt and no scale to measure them. The focus shifted. The Allies targeted the high-ranking, the notorious, the irrefutably guilty. SS officers, party leaders, Gestapo commanders, those whose hands were visibly stained with blood. The rest would be dealt with later, but later never came. In 1946, a decision was made. Local-level denazification would be handed over to the Germans themselves. The Americans and British, exhausted by the endless bureaucracy of guilt, decided to step back. The reasoning was pragmatic. A nation could not rebuild if half its population was in prison, so the files were closed. The ashes of the past were literally burned. In some cities, Allied officers ordered the destruction of local Gestapo records to prevent vigilantism. The official reason was to avoid chaos. The unofficial reason was simpler: too many names, too little time. The furnaces roared again, not for bodies this time, but for evidence. Whole cabinets of denunciation letters disappeared into fire. The heat curled, the pages turned signatures to dust. With them went accountability. And yet, amid the destruction, a quieter fire began to burn inside the hearts of those who had been betrayed. In towns like Würzburg and Oberammergau, survivors whispered among themselves. They knew who had written the letters, who had pointed the finger. They had seen them in the streets, in the churches, standing in ration lines as if nothing had happened. Some communities tried to act. They made lists of suspected informants, read them aloud in town meetings. For a few weeks, justice flickered. Then came the American orders: stop. Public shaming was forbidden. The focus must shift to reconstruction. The new Germany needed engineers, teachers, doctors, people who could work, not vengeance. so the people fell silent again. In homes across the country, the silence was palpable. At dinner tables, the war was never discussed. Fathers avoided their children's questions. Mothers said only, "It was a terrible time. You wouldn't understand." The children grew up surrounded by ghosts they were forbidden to name. Meanwhile, the informants rebuilt their lives. Many changed towns or jobs. Some reinvented themselves entirely. Without records, they became blank slates in a nation desperate to forget. And so the machinery of complicity was quietly repurposed for democracy. In Munich, Maria Schneider, once a Gestapo secretary who processed thousands of denunciation letters, found work as a school administrator. She spent the next 30 years managing teachers and students, her name never once mentioned in the war crimes archives. When a journalist finally located her in 1978, she shrugged. "I was only doing my job," she said. In Cologne, a man named Otto Brenner, who had managed informant networks during the war, destroyed his files and vanished. 2 years later, he reappeared with new papers, a new identity, and a new job: municipal housing official. For the next quarter century, he approved apartment applications for the same families whose names had once crossed his desk in Gestapo reports. These were not exceptions. They were the rule. The new West German state, founded in 1949, desperately needed people who could read, write, and manage institutions. It was built on continuity, not rupture. The bureaucracy of the old regime simply changed its letterhead. In one government ministry, nearly 70% of employees in 1951 had worked under the Nazis. In the courts, nearly half of the judges and prosecutors were former party members. The Gestapo was gone, but the culture of compliance remained. Justice had been sacrificed for stability. The result was a fragile peace, built atop denial. The survivors, those who had been denounced, imprisoned, or left to mourn the dead, learned to coexist with their former persecutors. They worked side by side in offices, taught in the same schools, worshipped in the same churches. No apologies were offered, none were expected. A strange social contract emerged, an agreement of silence. Victims would not speak, and perpetrators would not confess. The past would remain buried so that the present could survive. But silence, like guilt, has a way of festering. It seeps into the next generation, into the way people trust or fail to trust each other. The children of the informants grew up in homes where questions were dangerous. The children of the victims grew up beside those who had destroyed their families, never knowing why their parents flinched at certain names. Germany rebuilt itself into a modern democracy. But beneath the highways and factories, beneath the slogans of unity and progress, lay a moral fault line waiting to crack. And it would years later when the truth began to resurface. For now, though, in 1945 and 1946, the priority was survival. Reconstruction trumped remembrance. The hunger of the living outweighed justice for the dead. The world had moved on. The trials ended. The headlines faded, and the whispers of betrayal were swallowed by the hum of rebuilding cities. The informants had escaped earthly judgment, but history was not done with them yet. The ashes of those burned files would one day settle, revealing outlines that could not be erased, the invisible fingerprints of a nation that had chosen amnesia over truth. Justice had gone quiet, but not forever. Somewhere beneath the rubble and the silence, the names still waited. The fires and the ashes of the records, the fires that burned across Germany after 1945, were not only the remnants of war, they were the flames of deliberate forgetting. By order of the occupying forces, warehouses full of Gestapo files were fed into furnaces. The intention was pragmatic: prevent mob justice, stop witch hunts, make space for reconstruction. But in that practical act lay something far more profound: a symbolic cleansing. paper burned faster than conscience. Every report, every accusation, every signature that had sent a neighbor to prison or a Jew to death vanished in smoke. The air filled with the ghosts of names that would never be spoken again. The Allies, exhausted by war and overwhelmed by the enormity of Nazi documentation, made a choice rooted in realism. There were too many crimes, too many criminals, too much guilt, so they fed it to the fire. In Frankfurt, 10 trucks of Gestapo files were burned in one night. In Munich, whole basements of documents were doused in kerosene and set alight. The smell of ink and scorched paper lingered in the streets for days. The wind carried away the ash, thousands of names reduced to powder. For those who had written the denunciation letters, it was liberation. For those who had been betrayed, it was erasure. Some Allied officers expressed unease. Captain Harold Pierce, a U.S. intelligence officer stationed in Bavaria, wrote in a private letter, "We are burning evidence faster than we are collecting it. It feels less like justice and more like mercy for the guilty." But orders were orders. Reconstruction needed speed, not reflection. A clean slate, a fresh start. Those words became the gospel of the new Germany. Yet the slate was not truly clean. Beneath the ashes, fragments remained: scorched papers stuffed in filing cabinets, forgotten boxes sealed in damp basements, or stashed in attics by those too afraid to destroy them. The clerks who once typed denunciations became guardians of their own guilt, unable to part with the proof, yet terrified it might resurface. In the town of Bremen, a janitor named Heinrich Krantz stumbled upon one such box in 1953. Inside were over 200 denunciation letters written during the war. Each one bore the same heading: to the secret state police. He took them to the mayor expecting outrage, expecting justice. Instead, he was told quietly, "Best not to stir the past, Herr Krantz. People have rebuilt their lives now." The box was sealed again and moved to the city archive, where it remained untouched for nearly 3 decades. Across the nation, silence became policy. It wasn't only government that enforced it, it was society itself. Those who remembered too much risked social exile. Survivors who dared to speak found doors closed. Friends vanished, jobs lost. The collective will to forget was stronger than the desire to heal. For many, forgetting was a form of survival. The ruins needed hands to rebuild, not voices to accuse. And so the fires that destroyed the Gestapo's archives also destroyed a nation's chance to reckon with itself. But memory has a strange resilience. In the 1960s and 1970s, as post-war prosperity blossomed, small discoveries began to surface. A historian named Jürgen Matthias uncovered partial Gestapo files hidden inside a former police station wall in Lübeck. Another researcher, Helga Trimborn, found a collection of carbon copies from denunciation letters misfiled in a tax office. Each fragment revealed the same pattern: the informants were everywhere. Teachers, postal workers, farmers, nurses, ordinary faces, ordinary names. The letters themselves were chilling, not because of cruelty, but because of normalcy. My neighbor often listens to foreign broadcasts and criticizes our Führer. I believe this may harm national morale. A woman on the second floor is harboring someone of Jewish descent. I fear she endangers the community. My coworker refuses to salute properly. I worry he might be a communist. Each one written with precision grammar, correct tone, polite. Each one a small piece of a vast moral machinery that had functioned not through hatred, but through habit. When these fragments reached public attention, they provoked unease rather than outrage. People read the names and felt recognition. That teacher, that pharmacist, that clerk, still alive, still respected, still part of the new Germany. But these were exceptions. Most records had vanished. The destruction of evidence left deep scars in the moral landscape. Without documentation, the line between victim and perpetrator blurred. Memories faded, stories conflicted, and the truth became a fog that no one dared to clear. The official stance of both the Allies and the new West German state was reconciliation through forgetting. But forgetting has its own cost. In towns where everyone knew everyone, silence bred poison. Victims knew the faces of their betrayers. Informants knew that others knew. The result was a quiet, uneasy coexistence like living in a house built over unmarked graves. The Catholic Church played its part too. In confessionals across Germany, priests listened as parishioners unburdened themselves of wartime sins. But absolution required no testimony, no restitution. Spiritual forgiveness replaced moral accountability. Many left the confessional believing their past had been wiped clean by God Himself. And so, the smoke from those burned files became a kind of secular incense, rising, dissipating, blessing the guilty. For decades, the official story was that the Gestapo archives had been lost to war. The truth that they had been destroyed deliberately remained unspoken. Only in rare moments did the truth surface, often by accident. In 1974, construction workers renovating a courthouse in Nuremberg found several metal crates sealed behind a wall. Inside were records of 1,400 citizens who had informed during the war. Most of the informants were dead, but a few were still alive. Some even held public office. When journalists broke the story, the government intervened within days. The crates were quietly transferred to the Federal Archive in Koblenz, access restricted for privacy reasons. History was still being buried, this time under bureaucracy, but a few voices refused to go silent. Journalists, students, and survivors began to demand answers. Why had so much evidence been destroyed? Why were the files that survived still locked away? Whose privacy was being protected, the victims or the perpetrators? As West Germany entered its so-called economic miracle in the 1950s and 60s, success became a convenient distraction. A new house, a new car, a new nation. These were the trophies of forgetting. Yet beneath that prosperity lay an unresolved past that would one day resurface with the force of revelation. Every burned file was a small victory for the guilty, but also a ticking bomb for the future. Because what is buried in silence does not disappear, it festers. The destruction of the Gestapo archives was not only an act of erasure, it was the creation of myth. It allowed a generation to tell itself we didn't know. It allowed another generation to grow up believing their parents had been powerless. It gave comfort to those who betrayed and confusion to those betrayed. But history, like the truth, cannot be burned completely. In the years that followed, fragments continued to reappear. Letters tucked into family Bibles, notes found behind wallpaper testimonies whispered by the dying. Piece by piece, the invisible record began to reconstruct itself, and what those fragments revealed was not merely the machinery of terror, but the humanity that enabled it, the ordinariness of evil, the quiet bureaucracy of betrayal, the fires that burned both evidence and conscience alike. The ashes of the records became the ashes of remembrance. And in those ashes, historians began to sift for what the flames had failed to consume: the truth of how a nation once built an empire of silence and how it tried desperately to live with the ghosts it created. Faces that returned. When the war ended, Germany's streets filled with returning faces, familiar, ordinary, and hauntingly unchanged. The same people who had once filled Gestapo offices with letters and whispers now stood in ration lines, rebuilt shops, and reopened schools. The war was over, but the human machinery that had sustained it had merely shed its uniforms. In every town, the pattern was the same. The official agents of terror were gone, but their civilian collaborators had melted seamlessly back into society. Some wore guilt like a shadow they refused to acknowledge. Others wore it like armor, convincing themselves that survival had absolved them. The Allies had neither the manpower nor the appetite to hunt them all. By 1947, the files were gone, the trials dwindled, and normalcy became the new goal. Normalcy is a strange word. It can disguise anything. And so the faces that once watched others disappear into black cars reappeared behind counters, in classrooms, in churches. They smiled again. They shook hands. They called it peace. But some names, some stories refused to fade. Wilhelm Kube was one of them. During the war, he had managed Gestapo informant networks across occupied Belarus, coordinating local collaborators and civilian spies. Thousands were arrested under his watch. Yet when the Reich fell, Kube reinvented himself overnight. He moved to West Germany, joined the newly founded Christian Democratic Union, and by 1949 he had won election to the Bundestag, the national parliament. The irony was obscene. The man who had once built a system of surveillance now sat in the halls of democracy preaching civic duty and Christian renewal. He served 12 years in office, retiring quietly in the 1960s with honors pensions and no questions asked. When a journalist later uncovered his past, the story barely made the papers. West Germany had no appetite for ghosts. Maria Schneider's story was quieter, but no less telling. She had been a Gestapo secretary in Munich, responsible for processing thousands of denunciation letters. Her typewriter, old, heavy, and precise, had stamped the names of hundreds who would never return. When the war ended, Schneider moved south to Augsburg, where she applied for a job as a school administrator. Her references were impeccable. No one asked for more. For 30 years, she worked in education, managing teachers, overseeing children, even lecturing on discipline and civic responsibility. In 1978, when an investigative journalist tracked her down, she was living in a modest house, retired, widowed, unbothered. I never heard anyone, she told him. I was only following orders. I didn't choose who they arrested. It was the same refrain repeated 1,000 times across 1,000 lives. I didn't know. I was afraid. I had no choice. But choice had always existed. It was simply easier to surrender it. Then there was Otto Brenner, a name that appeared in both Gestapo and post-war municipal records. During the war, he managed informant networks in Cologne. His desk handled over 300 denunciation cases, each one a careful study in paranoia. As the Allies approached, he destroyed his files, fled south to Bavaria, and disappeared. 2 years later, he re-emerged with forged papers and a new name, Otto Baumann. He found work as a housing officer for the municipal government. His job, approving apartment applications for displaced citizens. Among those he processed were survivors of the camp's people whose names had once passed across his desk in reports marked suspicious activity. He worked there for 26 years, quietly, efficiently, until his retirement in 1973. No one ever questioned him. In a way, these people embodied the strange genius of post-war amnesia. They had not escaped justice through cunning, but through normalcy. They simply blended into the fabric of a society desperate to move forward. The post-war years demanded rebuilding, and rebuilding required experience. Engineers, clerks, judges, teachers, these were the very people who had served the old regime. Firing them all would have meant paralysis, so the new democratic Germany welcomed them back under a new banner. Continuity became a form of denial. The ministries were rebuilt using the same desks, the same filing cabinets, the same employees. In the West German judiciary, more than half of all judges in the 1950s had served under Hitler. Many had once sentenced race defilers and traitors under Nazi law. Now they presided over divorce cases, inheritance disputes, and property rights, quietly deciding the fates of the same kinds of people they had once condemned. One such man, Franz Becker, had been a racial court judge in Munich. He'd sentenced 89 people to prison or deportation for racial crimes, mixed marriages, Jewish ancestry, forbidden relationships. After 1945, he moved to a small Bavarian town and opened a family law practice. Clients came to him for help with custody cases. They left with polite handshakes, never suspecting the history behind the man who offered legal advice. Doctors and scientists found refuge too. The men who had performed experiments in camps simply moved to new hospitals. Some fled to Austria. Others stayed in West Germany, protected by the chaos of Reconstruction. Dr. Ernst Richter, for example, had worked in a Berlin psychiatric ward where he tested lethal injection methods on patients. 47 people died under his supervision. After the war, Richter vanished, resurfacing in Salzburg under a new name. For the next 30 years, he ran a small pediatric practice. Parents adored him. Children trusted him. No one ever learned what kind of medicine he had once practiced. This was the moral paradox of post-war Germany, a nation rebuilding itself with the same hands that had destroyed it. Each story revealed a small, almost invisible act of forgiveness, not from compassion, but from necessity. Every time an informant was rehired, every time a judge or doctor resumed his post, society said, "We must move on." And yet each act of forgetting planted another seed of rot in the soil of remembrance. Not everyone accepted the silence. Some survivors refused to forget. In small towns, quiet reckonings took place. In the Bavarian village of Oberammergau, locals compiled lists of wartime informants. They pinned them to the church doors, demanding acknowledgement. For a few weeks, the town was consumed by whispers, confrontations, and shame. Then the American military authorities stepped in, calling the lists unhelpful to post-war unity. The names were taken down. The lesson was clear: forgiveness wasn't optional, it was policy. And so those who had betrayed and those who had suffered lived side by side. They exchanged polite greetings in markets. Their children played together in the streets. The pain was buried, but never gone. The victims carried their memories like invisible scars. They knew who had written the letters. They remembered who had looked away. But without proof, they had no voice. Without records, they had no justice. This quiet coexistence became the foundation of a new Germany, efficient, industrious, forward-looking, and haunted. One story from Würzburg captures it perfectly. In 1942, a man named Jacob Stern was denounced by his neighbor, Friedrich Koh, for listening to BBC radio broadcasts. Stern spent 2 years in Dachau. When he returned home after the war, his house was still standing, and so was Friedrich Koh, now wearing a new badge. He had joined the post-war police. Stern never reported him. What would be the point, he told a friend. They would only hire another one like him. That sentence, half despair, half resignation, became the moral summary of an entire generation. The faces that returned were not only the ones who had done harm, but also the ones who could no longer tell right from wrong. They had lived through 12 years of a system that rewarded obedience and punished conscience. When the smoke cleared, they mistook silence for virtue, and yet beneath the facade of normalcy, guilt festered. Some informants lived out their lives in peace. Others were consumed by quiet paranoia, certain that one day someone would knock on their door. A few confessed to priests, some wrote letters of apology, never mailed. but most simply carried on, convinced that the past was best left buried. The new German democracy was built on those silences, the unspoken agreement that stability mattered more than truth. It worked for a while. The country grew rich, powerful, respected again. But moral debts have long memories. By the 1970s, a new generation would begin to ask questions their parents could not answer. And when they did, the faces that had once returned would face a second reckoning, not in court, but in the hearts of their children. The truth, like the dead, cannot stay buried forever. That's Germany and the rebirth of surveillance. When the war ended, Germany did not become one country again. It became two mirrors reflecting different lies. In the West, silence was the price of stability. In the East, confession was the cost of loyalty. Both promised redemption, but neither delivered it. The Soviet occupation zones moved swiftly to claim the moral high ground. Their message was simple: we have purged the fascists. The new Germany begins here, but beneath the slogans, the old habits returned. The faces of those who once served the Reich reappeared, only now they served a different master. The Stasi, East Germany's secret police, was born from the ruins of the Gestapo. Its architects studied the old system, borrowed its files, and even hired some of its veterans. Surveillance did not die with the Third Reich. It was reborn in the German Democratic Republic, baptized in red flags and new slogans. The irony was breathtaking. By 1952, the Ministry for State Security Ministerium für Staatssicherheit had become one of the most feared intelligence agencies in the world. But it did not begin from scratch. It began with people who already knew how to listen, how to watch, how to betray. Among them was a man named Gustav Hermann. During the Nazi years, Hermann had been an eager Gestapo informant in Dresden. He reported 17 of his neighbors for anti-German activity. 3 of them died in concentration camps. After 1945, he disappeared for a few years, then re-emerged in East Germany as a loyal communist. The new regime valued his experience. The Stasi recruited him in 1952. Over the next 3 decades, he informed on 41 colleagues. When his name appeared in the Stasi files after German reunification in 1990, he was 87 years old, too old to prosecute, too old for punishment, but not too old for shame. Hermann's story was not unique, it was archetypal. The Stasi found in these men and women precisely what it needed: people who understood that survival meant obedience, that trust was weakness, that information was power. The system they built was eerily familiar. In the Nazi era, the Gestapo had depended on denunciations to maintain control. In East Germany, the Stasi perfected the art. They called it inoffiziell Mitarbeiter, unofficial collaborators, ordinary citizens who spied on their co-workers, their friends, even their spouses. By the 1970s, East Germany, with a population of just 17 million, had nearly 200,000 informants. That's 1 informer for every 85 people, an astonishing ratio, far higher than anything the Gestapo had ever achieved. The methods were new, the spirit was old. Informing became a way of life, a quiet, anxious rhythm of watching and reporting. The same excuses returned. I was only protecting my country. I was told it was necessary. If I didn't do it, someone else would. The difference now was ideology. Where the Gestapo had used nationalism, the Stasi used socialism, but both played the same symphony of fear. In the small town of Erfurt, a woman named Clara Weiss served as a Gestapo informant during the war, reporting suspicious conversations in her boarding house. 20 years later, she was recruited by the Stasi to report on foreign students living in East Germany. Her reports were nearly identical in tone, polite, detailed, always signed at the bottom. "I remain loyal to the Republic," she wrote. echoing the same words she once wrote to the Führer's police. It was as if conscience had simply been rebranded. The East German regime claimed it had eradicated fascism, yet it had quietly adopted its psychology. Citizens once trained to obey the Führer were now trained to obey the party. The ideology had changed. The architecture of control had not. Surveillance became an everyday ritual. Typewriters clicked behind closed doors, telephones buzzed with faint clicks of interception, and letters arrived already opened. The Stasi even studied the Gestapo's interrogation techniques, refining them into psychological torture, humiliation, sleep deprivation, social isolation. They called it Zersetzung, the process of decomposition, the slow destruction of a person's reputation, friendships, and sanity. Many who once lived through the Gestapo years recognize the rhythm immediately. It feels the same, one East German dissident later said, only the portraits on the wall have changed. The tragic continuity was not accidental, it was generational. The children of Nazi informants grew up learning that silence meant safety, that speaking one's mind could be fatal. When the Stasi came knocking, they complied without hesitation. They had inherited not ideology, but instinct. And so, the East German government built its anti-fascist state on the very foundations of fascist behavior. The same streets that once echoed with Gestapo boots now held Stasi cars. The same apartment blocks that had housed Nazi informants now hid microphones behind wallpaper. The language of fear had simply been translated. One former Stasi officer interviewed after the fall of the Berlin Wall admitted we saw ourselves as the guardians of purity, just as the Gestapo once did. Only the word enemy had changed. In both systems, the ultimate goal was control through complicity. The regime didn't need to watch everyone, it needed everyone to believe they could be watched. And it worked. Decades passed. Families were divided. Friendships shattered, lives quietly destroyed. Informants received small rewards, better housing, promotions, the illusion of purpose. The same hunger for belonging that once fueled the Nazi surveillance machine now fed its socialist successor. The parallels ran deeper still. When West Germans began uncovering fragments of Gestapo files in the 1970s, East German historians used the discoveries for propaganda. See, they said the fascists still live in the West. We have cleansed ourselves. But in truth, the East had only perfected the art of control. The Gestapo's shadow stretched across both sides of the divided nation. In the West, it lived in silence. In the East, in repetition. One German historian later described it perfectly. The Gestapo taught the German people how to inform. The Stasi taught them that they would never stop. When the Berlin Wall finally fell in 1989, East Germans rushed to the Stasi headquarters in Leipzig and Berlin, desperate to see what had been written about them. They broke into the buildings, overwhelmed guards, and stormed rooms filled with shredded paper. The air was thick with dust and disbelief. There, scattered across floors and desks, lay the echoes of two totalitarian regimes. Gestapo reports copied, repurposed, annotated. Some folders bore both stamps: Geheime Staatspolizei, Secret State Police, and Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, Ministry for State Security. The continuity was complete. Among the documents was one familiar name: Gustav Hermann. His file spanned both eras: Gestapo informant, Stasi collaborator. The same handwriting, the same neat reports, the same sentences repeated 40 years apart. When journalists confronted him in 1991, he stared at the floor. "You don't understand," he murmured. "We believed in something each time. It's not my fault if the world kept changing." He was wrong. The world had changed. He had not. For decades, Herman and others like him had lived in the comfortable twilight between guilt and justification. They had served 2 regimes, betrayed dozens, and convinced themselves they were patriots both times. After the reunification of Germany, when the Stasi files were made public, thousands of ordinary East Germans discovered the names of their betrayers, neighbors, colleagues, even family members. For some, it was closure. For others, it was unbearable. The revelation destroyed friendships, marriages, entire communities. But for historians, it confirmed what the fires of 1946 had tried to erase. The chain of surveillance in German history had never been broken. It had merely changed uniforms. The Gestapo had taught obedience. The Stasi institutionalized it. Between them stood a nation caught in an endless cycle of control and amnesia, guilt and silence. The men and women who once whispered in fear under Hitler whispered again under Honecker. The culture of informing, once learned, had become a national inheritance. And so, even after liberation, Germany had not truly escaped its past. The ghosts of the Gestapo lived on in every report, in every signature, in every act of betrayal justified as duty. The surveillance state had not died. It had only evolved. The long silence. The war had ended. The flags had changed, and the rubble had been cleared. But beneath the clean streets and the new facades, Germany lived under a silence thick enough to suffocate memory itself. The guns had gone quiet, but so had the truth. For decades after 1945, most Germans avoided speaking of the war at all. They spoke of hunger, yes, of cold winters, ration lines, and bombed-out homes. But not of betrayal, not of neighbors who had vanished after a knock on the door, not of the letters written to the Gestapo, not of the names whispered in fear. Those belonged to a past that no one wished to exhume. The silence was practical at first. People needed to work, eat, and rebuild. But over time, practicality became denial. It was easier to tell the children that everyone had suffered, that everyone had been a victim, than to explain that some had been victims of their own neighbors. By the early 1950s, a new moral order had settled across West Germany. Forgetting became a civic duty. The politicians called it moving forward. The newspapers called it reconstruction. The churches called it forgiveness. But the survivors knew what it really was: amnesia. They saw their tormentors in church pews and on city councils. The woman who had reported a Jewish family now sang in the choir. The man who had written a denunciation letter sat behind the police desk stamping travel permits. No one pointed fingers. No one dared. In towns like Würzburg, Cologne, and Nuremberg, unspoken knowledge lingered like a fog. Everyone knew who had done what, but to say it aloud was to break the fragile peace. So people smiled tightly and kept their distance. Children grew up in households where questions were forbidden. When they asked father, "What did you do in the war?" they were told, "We don't talk about that." The answer was always the same. Es war eine schwere Zeit. It was a difficult time. For some, silence was shame. For others, it was protection. For most, it was both. The post-war decades became an experiment in collective repression. Psychologists would later describe it as a national trauma buried alive. The weight of guilt and fear pressed down on an entire generation until even memory itself began to erode. Yet silence has a sound of its own. It echoes in the spaces where words should be, in the pauses, in the careful laughter, in the way people cross the street to avoid a familiar face. The victims bore this silence most heavily. Many had returned from camps or prisons, only to find that justice had evaporated. Their homes were occupied, their families scattered, and their betrayers untouched. To speak of what had happened was to reopen wounds that no one wanted to see. One survivor, a teacher named Ruth Engel, returned to her village in 1946 after 2 years in a labor camp. The neighbor who had denounced her, claiming she'd made defeatist remarks, still lived across the street. Ruth tried to confront her, but the woman only said, "We all suffered, Ruth. Why bring it up?" That phrase, "we all suffered," became the anthem of the post-war years. It leveled the field between victim and perpetrator, turning moral tragedy into shared misfortune. Everyone suffered, therefore, no one was guilty. The churches offered the same comfort. Confession replaced accountability. God forgives all who repent, the priest said, and many took that to mean repentance required no confession to the living. The silence became so thick that even art hesitated. The first films about the war showed Germans as victims, bombed, displaced, broken, but rarely as complicit. Literature, theater, and journalism followed suit. The word Gestapo became something distant, almost mythical, disconnected from the faces people saw every day. In East Germany, the silence took a different form. The state declared itself anti-fascist, claiming that all Nazis lived in the West. It was a convenient fiction that allowed the East to avoid confronting its own ghosts. But the same old habits, obedience, conformity, suspicion remained. There, too, the past was not discussed, only repurposed. In both Germanys, the moral reckoning that might have healed the wound never came. The silence passed from parents to children like an inheritance. The generation born in the 1950s and 60s, the so-called children of the war, grew up in prosperity, but with a gnawing sense of something unspoken. They felt it in the way their parents froze when the subject of the war arose, in the way they changed the subject or walked out of the room. By the 1970s, those children were adults, and they began to ask questions their parents could no longer dodge. The student protests of 1968 were not only about Vietnam or capitalism, they were about silence. Young Germans demanded to know why their professors, judges, and politicians had Nazi pasts. They shouted in the streets, "Unter den Talaren, Muf von 1000 Jahren," under the robes, the stench of 1,000 years. They meant the robes of their professors and judges, still wearing the moral dust of fascism. The confrontation split families apart. Fathers refused to speak. Sons refused to forgive. What had been buried for 30 years erupted like a fault line beneath the surface of a peaceful nation. Television began to change the narrative too. Documentaries aired interviews with survivors, camp guards, and most shockingly, former informants. The faces were old now, the voices trembling, but the excuses were the same. "I didn't know what would happen. I was afraid for my family. It was my duty." The words that had once justified everything now sounded hollow. In living rooms across the country, people watched in silence as the truth unfolded on their screens. For some, it was the first time they had ever heard what had really happened. For others, it was confirmation of what they had always suspected but never dared to say. The silence began to crack, but it did not yet break. Even as the new generation sought to uncover the truth, the institutions of power resisted. Archives remained sealed records hidden under the guise of privacy. The government insisted that reopening old wounds would serve no one. The irony was painful. The same reasoning that once justified the fires of 1946 now justified bureaucratic inaction. But history has a way of eroding even the thickest walls of denial. By the 1980s, local historians, often volunteers, teachers, or librarians, began to dig through surviving fragments of the Gestapo files. What they found stunned them. Names that had been forgotten appeared again. Names of schoolteachers, mayors, businessmen, men and women who had lived long, comfortable lives after the war. Communities were forced to confront their ghosts. Streets were renamed. Monuments were built not to the informants, but to their victims. Plaques appeared on buildings where people had been arrested or deported. Each one was a small rebellion against the long silence. Still, the reckoning was incomplete. For every name uncovered, thousands remained lost in the ashes of destroyed archives. For every act of contrition, 100 more were met with indifference. Some survivors never saw justice, but they did see remembrance. And in remembrance, there is a kind of justice, not the legal kind, but the moral kind that outlasts courts and verdicts. The long silence, though, finally cracked, left scars that would never fully heal. In the end, the silence was not just about what had been done, but about what it revealed: that evil does not vanish when the uniforms change, that guilt can survive without punishment, and that nations, like people, often choose comfort over truth. When the voices finally rose again, when the past began to speak, it did so not in anger, but in weariness. The silence had lasted too long, and yet even in its ending, it proved one thing beyond doubt: the greatest crime of all was not only what people did during the war, but what they chose not to remember after it. Taothir. When memory awoke. For 30 years, Germany had lived as if the past were sealed behind a locked door. But by the early 1970s, the hinges began to rust. Memory long buried under prosperity and politeness began to stir. And once it awoke, it refused to sleep again. It began quietly through books, conversations, whispers in classrooms. A new generation born after the war began to ask questions their parents couldn't answer. They had grown up in a country rebuilt from ashes, surrounded by comfort and order, yet haunted by something unspoken. Every photograph, every street corner, every family silence hinted at stories that didn't fit the narrative of victims of the war. Teachers skipped certain years in their history lessons. Politicians used words like renewal and rebirth, but never guilt. For these young Germans, the contradiction was unbearable. They had inherited not just the rebuilt nation, but also the unspoken shame that underpinned it. And so, they demanded truth. The student revolts of 1968, angry, chaotic, idealistic, were not simply about politics or imperialism. They were about memory. When protesters shouted "never again," they weren't just rejecting fascism, they were rejecting their parents' silence. They accused them of cowardice, of moral sleepwalking, of pretending not to know what had happened while it was happening. It was the first time in post-war Germany that children had publicly accused their parents of moral complicity. At dinner tables, tempers flared, fathers stormed out, mothers wept. What had been buried in shame now erupted into arguments that split families down the middle. But once spoken, the questions could not be unsaid. Television became the new courtroom. In the mid-1970s, documentary filmmakers began to air interviews with former SS officers, concentration camp survivors, and most shocking of all, Gestapo informants. The camera lingered on trembling faces, aged hands, eyes that refused to meet the lens. When asked, "Do you regret what you did?" the answers were eerily similar. "I was afraid. I didn't know what would happen. We were told it was necessary." The public watched in stunned silence. For many, it was the first time they realized the enemy had not been monsters, but neighbors. Ordinary, frightened, obedient people. One of the most striking programs aired in 1978, titled Die Denunzianten, The Informants. It explored how thousands of Germans had voluntarily written denunciation letters to the Gestapo. The filmmakers found some of them still alive, still living normal lives. One woman smiled shyly when asked about her wartime actions. "I only wrote a few letters." It was the rule then. The phrase, "it was the rule then," echoed across living rooms like a confession of a deeper illness, a nation so devoted to order that it mistook obedience for virtue. The silence began to fracture. Books followed. Journalists dug into old municipal archives, uncovering names of teachers, doctors, mayors, and clerks who had once informed. Local newspapers published lists. Suddenly, towns were confronted with the knowledge that the man who handed out bread coupons or graded exams had once written a letter that sent someone to a camp. Some responded with outrage, others with denial. Many simply turned the page and went on with their day. But the cracks were spreading. In schools, young teachers began to assign books once considered too painful. Anne Frank's diary, Primo Levi's memoirs, and later local testimonies. Students read them with disbelief and then turned to their parents with a question that hung like a verdict. Where were you? The answer was usually silence or anger, but not everyone stayed silent. Some former informants, now elderly, began to confess, not out of guilt, but exhaustion. They told journalists, "We thought it was right. We were told it was patriotic. We were frightened." Their words, though honest, revealed how deeply the ideology of obedience had sunk into the national soul. The 1970s also brought something else, the first attempts at remembrance. Across West Germany, local historians, often unpaid volunteers, began to compile lists of victims, those who had been denounced, arrested, or disappeared. They interviewed surviving families, tracked down fragments of letters, and placed plaques on buildings where arrests had occurred. Small brass memorials called Stolperstein stumbling stones were embedded in sidewalks, each engraved with a name, a date of fate. You could not walk through a German city without seeing them, little squares of brass glinting between the cobblestones, forcing passers-by to remember the names that history had once burned away. Remembrance became a rebellion, but for every act of honesty there was resistance. Conservative politicians called the young historians traitors to their heritage. Newspapers accused them of digging up the dead. The phrase Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past, entered the German language, but it often sounded like a bureaucratic spell, a way of naming guilt without feeling it. Still, the movement grew. Churches began to confront their own complicity. Sermons spoke of moral courage, of repentance, not just before God, but before history. In one parish in Bavaria, a priest named Father Anton Heigl organized a day of remembrance for victims of denunciation. Among the attendees were the children of those very informants. Some cried. Others sat stone-faced, refusing to look at the memorial photos projected on the wall. It was painful, awkward, raw, but it was real. By the late 1980s, television again carried the torch of memory. A groundbreaking miniseries Holocaust aired in West Germany in 1979. Though it told an Americanized story, its impact was seismic. Millions watched in tears, horrified not only by the crimes, but by how little they had spoken of them. After the final episode aired, phone lines to national TV stations lit up with callers confessing family secrets, denouncing relatives, asking questions no one had dared to ask before. The wall of silence had finally cracked open, but what emerged was not only truth, it was grief. Whole generations were forced to confront that their families had been both victims and perpetrators, silent witnesses and silent accomplices, guilt mixed with sorrow, pride with horror. The simplicity of good and evil dissolved, leaving behind only the unbearable complexity of being human. For the first time, Germany began to see itself not as a victim of history, but as its custodian. Universities introduced programs on Holocaust studies. Memorials expanded. School children visited concentration camps as part of their education. The process was messy, emotional, sometimes hypocritical, but it was progress. Yet even in this awakening, one truth remained constant. Most of the Gestapo informants had already died. They had lived long, comfortable lives, drawing pensions, celebrating birthdays, passing quietly in their sleep. Justice had not touched them, but memory had found them. The nation began to understand that remembrance itself could be a form of justice, not revenge, but revelation, not punishment, but truth. As one historian wrote at the time, the past is not over when the last perpetrator dies. It ends when the last lie is told. And Germany, after decades of silence, was finally learning to stop lying to others and to itself. The awakening was not a single moment, but a slow, painful unfolding, a reckoning that turned over every stone, every secret, every memory once buried beneath the ashes of convenience. And yet, even as the truth surfaced, one final twist remained hidden in the dark archives of a divided nation, a discovery that would prove that the ghosts of the Gestapo were not only remembered, they were still waiting. The double shadow from Gestapo to Stasi. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Germany faced its second reckoning in half a century. The first had come with rubble and ashes. The second came with paper millions of pages of it. Behind the guarded doors of the Stasi headquarters in Berlin, Leipzig, and Dresden lay a secret that would reopen the oldest wound in modern German history, the revelation that the ghost of the Gestapo had never truly died. It had simply changed its name. In the jubilant days following reunification, protesters stormed Stasi buildings, desperate to destroy or preserve the evidence of 40 years of surveillance. Inside, they found mountains of shredded documents, broken safes, and half-burned folders, an empire of fear collapsing into chaos. Among the fragments, researchers uncovered a grim continuity. Hundreds of former Gestapo informants had gone on to work for the Stasi. The irony was cruel. The Nazi slogan of national security had been replaced by socialist protection, but the machinery of control was identical. Same method, same mindset, even some of the same men. The past, it seemed, had not been buried. It had been archived. One of the names to reappear in both sets of files was Gustav Hermann. During the Nazi era, he had denounced 17 neighbors for anti-German sentiments. 3 of them died in camps. After the war, he resurfaced in East Germany, where his experience in community monitoring earned him a position as a trusted citizen collaborator. Between 1952 and 1984, he filed 41 reports for the Stasi, this time against enemies of socialism. His words changed, but his handwriting remained the same. When his victims finally discovered his identity after reunification, Hermann was 87. Too frail to stand trial, too old to be punished, he offered a defense that echoed across decades. "I was only serving my country." The double shadow of Gestapo and Stasi revealed an unsettling truth. Surveillance in Germany was not a temporary symptom of dictatorship, but a habit of thought. Generations had grown up believing that to inform was to protect, that loyalty was measured in silence, and that power was safest when it listened to everything. Historians tracing the transition between Nazi and communist Germany found astonishing overlaps. In Dresden, nearly 1 in 5 early Stasi officials had once worked for the Gestapo or SS intelligence. Files showed that recruitment was deliberate. Soviet advisors encouraged the hiring of experienced security personnel. Their rationale was coldly practical. They already know how to make people talk. The cycle of obedience continued. Under Hitler, citizens were taught that the Führer saw and knew everything. Under the Stasi, they were told the party did. Both were omnipresent myths, each transforming fear into loyalty. In the East, people learned to whisper again, to censor themselves, to report others before being reported. Every letter, every phone call, every joke could be recorded, copied, filed away. The Stasi improved on Gestapo methods through technology, but not morality. They planted microphones in walls, cameras behind mirrors, listening devices inside lamps. Their reports filled 180 kilometers of shelving an industrial monument to paranoia. The Gestapo's dream of perfect control had finally been realized, not through force, but through participation. In Leipzig, a former Gestapo secretary named Irma Vogel became a Stasi office clerk in the 1950s. She had once typed interrogation transcripts for the Nazis. Now she transcribed ideological deviation reports for the socialists. When interviewed in the 1990s, she said, "The words changed, but the sentences stayed the same." Her remark captured the essence of East Germany's moral inheritance. The Stasi did not invent total surveillance, it inherited it. The moral infrastructure had already been built by millions of ordinary people who decades earlier had learned that security was sacred and conscience expendable. In small towns, former Gestapo informants guided Stasi officers to families once labeled politically unreliable. Old suspicions resurfaced like weeds pushing through cracked pavement. Jews who had survived the camps were monitored for Zionist tendencies. Priests were tracked for Western sympathies. In one case, an elderly woman named Clara Weiss, who had written denunciation letters during the Nazi era, was recruited again by the Stasi to spy on her neighbors. Her reports were still written in the same careful, polite tone signed "Yours faithfully." To the East German government, these were model citizens. To history, they were proof that ideology may change, but the psychology of control endures. When Germany reunited, the opening of the Stasi files in 1991 became an unprecedented act of collective introspection. Millions requested access to their dossiers. For some, the revelations were devastating. Husbands discovered that their wives had informed on them. Priests learned their parishioners were spies. Friends learned that every shared secret had been copied and cataloged. One man, a musician from Rostock, read his file and found hundreds of pages documenting his life. The songs he played, the jokes he told, the letters he wrote to his mother. The informer's name stunned him, his best friend since childhood. These revelations tore families apart, but they also exposed the deeper truth that had haunted Germany since 1945. Betrayal had never been an exception. It had been a system, one that could survive any flag, any anthem, any ideology. As journalists pieced together the Gestapo-Stasi continuum, they discovered something chilling in the files. In the early 1950s, East German officials had requested surviving Gestapo records from Soviet archives. The Soviets complied, providing lists of reliable informants. Those names were cross-checked, and many were quietly re-recruited into the new secret police. A single bureaucratic transaction had bridged the moral abyss between fascism and communism. To the outside world, East Germany appeared reformed, an anti-fascist state built on the promise of equality. Inside, it was the same architecture of fear, now painted in different colors. The Gestapo had taught Germany how to watch itself. The Stasi ensured it never stopped. In the 1990s, after the archives opened, one historian remarked, "We thought we were studying two systems, but it is one story of obedience, memory, and the seduction of order." The German people once again faced a choice to look away or to look within. This time, they chose to look. The files became public, and for the first time in modern history, a nation confronted its own machinery of control. Citizens lined up for hours to read what the state had known about them. Many wept, some raged. Others laughed bitterly at the absurdity of it all, how power had been sustained, not by brutality alone, but by trust betrayed. One document found in Berlin summarized the relationship perfectly. The people supply information, the party provides protection. The system cannot function without either. That sentence could have been written in 1936 or 1966. It made no difference. The double shadow of Gestapo and Stasi taught a cruel lesson that tyranny is not a political ideology, but a psychological condition. It grows wherever people fear freedom more than control, wherever obedience is rewarded more than conscience. In the years following reunification, as Germany rebuilt yet again, this time as one nation, a strange realization took hold. The walls of division, the literal concrete ones and the invisible moral ones, had been built not only by governments, but by generations of citizens who learned that safety lay in silence. The fall of the Berlin Wall did more than unite East and West. It forced the entire country to confront the ghost that had haunted both sides, the enduring comfort of complicity. And when the dust settled, historians turn back to the oldest question of all, the same one that had opened the first fires in 1945. If everyone was only following orders, then who gave them? The answer, now clearer than ever, was chilling in its simplicity. No one had to. The sealed room, justice at last. For 75 years, the story of Germany's informants had remained half-written, its final pages, lost, burned, or buried under rubble. But history has a strange persistence. What we destroy to forget has a way of surviving, waiting to be found. In 2019, construction workers renovating a government building in Frankfurt stumbled upon something impossible. A false wall in the basement sealed with bricks that didn't match the rest of the foundation. Behind it, the air was stale, the floor layered with dust. When they broke through, the beam of a flashlight revealed a metal handle, then another and another. 17 filing cabinets lined the narrow room, untouched since the war. Each cabinet was labeled with a year: 1933, 1934, 1935, through 1945. Inside lay what the fire had failed to consume: the complete Gestapo informant records for the region. Names, addresses, letters of denunciation, arrest reports, interrogation transcripts. Over 40,000 documents perfectly preserved in the dark. For the archivist called to the scene, it was like opening a tomb and finding it still occupied. The files were transferred to the German Federal Archives under tight security. Historians and forensic specialists began the painstaking work of cataloging and digitizing each page. As they opened the drawers, the same handwriting appeared again and again. Neighbors denouncing neighbors' friends, betraying friends. Some letters began with politeness. "Dear sir, I regret to inform you." Others were blunt, even triumphant. One read simply, "The Jew in apartment 3 has returned." Another worker at the mill told a joke about the Führer. "I thought it my duty to report this." Every page was a ghost speaking through ink. The discovery sent shockwaves through Germany. Newspapers called it the archive nobody knew existed. For decades, scholars had estimated that over 90% of Gestapo files were destroyed after the war. Now, a fragment of that lost history had returned from the dead. The reaction was immediate and emotional. Some families rushed to know if their relatives' names were inside. Others begged for the archives to remain sealed. What good can come from reopening old wounds? One woman asked on national television. But the historians knew the answer. Truth, however, painful, is never wasted. For months, teams worked around the clock scanning and cross-referencing the documents with post-war employment records, church registries, and civil service rosters. The results were staggering. Among the names were dozens of prominent post-war citizens, judges, doctors, mayors, even parliamentarians. Some had been decorated for public service. Others had retired with full pensions. Many were already dead, but their names, their letters, their words had survived. One file contained a thick stack of correspondence from a small-town teacher named Greta Muller. During the war, she had reported 12 students and 3 fellow teachers for anti-Nazi sentiment. 2 of the students died in camps. After 1945, she moved to Hamburg, became a headmistress, and taught for nearly 30 years. Her students remembered her as strict but fair. Her letters, now public, revealed another truth, the same precision she once used to report disloyal elements she later used to grade homework. Another folder bore the signature of Dr. Heinrich Vogel, an accountant who had managed confiscated Jewish property in Vienna. He had written meticulous inventories of stolen homes, businesses, and heirlooms. After the war, he founded an accounting firm that helped families recover war losses, charging fees to process insurance claims for the very properties he had once cataloged as loot. Case after case revealed the same pattern reinvention without repentance. When journalists broke the story in 2020, Germany found itself staring into the mirror again. The headlines were not about monsters or madmen. They were about accountants, teachers, priests, secretaries. The ordinariness of it all made it unbearable. The public debate reignited old questions. Should the names be published? Should descendants bear responsibility for uncovering their families' histories? Was it right to expose the dead when the living had long moved on? For many, it felt as if the war had ended only yesterday. One historian described it poignantly. The silence that began in 1945 has finally ended, but it has ended with a whisper of paper. The digitization project known as the Frankfurt Files took 3 years. By 2022, the entire collection was online cross-referenced with existing Nazi and post-war administrative databases. The result was a digital monument, millions of searchable names, dates, and documents connecting wartime informants to post-war lives. It was the reckoning that history had postponed for 3/4 of a century. Among the revelations was a discovery that stunned researchers. A significant number of Gestapo informants had gone on to collaborate with the Stasi in East Germany. Their names appeared in both archives, bridging the twin systems of totalitarian control. It was proof in black and white of what historians had long suspected: the surveillance state had not ended in 1945. It had only migrated. The discovery of the sealed room forced Germany and the world to face a final, unsettling truth. Justice delayed is not justice denied. It is justice transformed. No court would ever try the dead. No cell would ever confine them. But now, at last, their names were known. Their victims or the descendants of those victims could finally speak their names aloud, not to curse them, but to reclaim the memory of what had been stolen by silence. In 2023, a memorial exhibition opened in Berlin titled "The Whispers Have Names." It displayed copies of the letters projected onto walls, read aloud by actors. Visitors stood in silence as the voices filled the room. The betrayal, the pettiness, the fear. Each whisper carried the weight of a human choice. At the center of the exhibition was a quote from philosopher Hannah Arendt. The sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil. Visitors left shaken not only by what they learned about history, but by what it revealed about themselves. Because the story of the Gestapo informants was not only a story about Germany, it was a story about the human heart, about what happens when fear becomes a language, when silence becomes morality, when obedience replaces thought. In that sense, the sealed room in Frankfurt was more than a historical discovery. It was a mirror showing that every generation must decide whether to look away or to face the shadows it inherits. Today, the files are part of a public archive available to scholars, descendants, and anyone who dares to confront the uncomfortable truth. The names are not erased nor glorified, but recorded because remembering is the only antidote to repetition. Justice did not come in the form of prisons or trials. It came as knowledge, as remembrance, as an unbroken chain of human voices carried through time. And somewhere in the digital glow of those scanned pages, in the scrawl of a trembling signature, the ink of an accusation, the bureaucratic precision of a crime, there lies the final answer to the question that began this story. What happened to the Gestapo informants after the war? They lived, they prospered, they blended back into the crowd, but in the end, history found them not to punish, but to remember. For the one thing even time cannot destroy is the record of truth. And now, after 75 years of silence, the whispers finally have names.